Hi there. Today I want to talk to you about ways to practice and demonstrate diligence. As you can see in my title, I'm talking about 5 other ways to practice and demonstrate diligence. That's because in my last flash video, I suggested 5 ways to practice and demonstrate diligence. So I'm coming back to you today with 5 other ways. I do have a few words to say here about just a bit of terminology before we get started. So let's just come back to what's an obligation and what does that mean in the context of a nonprofit director or officer. So an obligation is what you must do. They are non-negotiable tasks. Your obligation goes beyond responsibility in a contractual or legal sense. So an obligation refers to formal requirements that a person or organization must meet under agreements, regulations, and or ethical or legal standards. Obligations are binding commitments, and a failure to meet them can have consequences. So as a nonprofit director or officer, you have obligations, things that you must do. As a nonprofit director or officer, you also have a fiduciary duty. This refers to who you're doing it for. So a person or organization, in your case a person, is considered a fiduciary when they hold or manage assets or interests on behalf of someone else. In your case, it would be on behalf of an organization, based on a relationship of trust. This includes a legal and ethical duty to manage those assets or interests with high levels of care and loyalty. So you have obligations, what you must do, and as a nonprofit director or officer, you're a fiduciary. So you do have fiduciary duties. And this is the frame around due diligence. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. But first, let's just quickly overview what are some of the fiduciary obligations of board members, so of directors or officers. So board members have legal and ethical duties, which state that they must act in the best interest of the organization, pardon me. These are based on principles of loyalty, diligence, and transparency, and they are similar, like I said before, to the standards applied to directors of private or public corporations. So what is due diligence then? Well, it's a legal and ethical concept referring to the duty to act with the level of care, caution, and responsibility expected from a reasonable person placed under similar circumstances. Like I've said before, it's often applied to board members and executives, including those of nonprofits. And it is to ensure that they carry out their roles thoughtfully and in the best interest of the organization. I'm also going to make a nuance here, the practicing versus demonstrating due diligence. I think most of you probably are already familiar with the concept of due diligence, and I want to be as practical as possible in my videos. So we're going to talk about practicing due diligence, which is the ability of directors and officers to adopt behaviors that enable them to meet legal requirements while making the best possible decisions, of course, always for the well-being of the organization, free from external influence. So that is practicing diligence. And what is demonstrating due diligence in our case? It's the organization's ability to provide evidence and operate in a way that allows it to show to authorities, to an external auditor or a court, that it is acting with due diligence or that it acted with due diligence. So what does practicing due diligence really look like? Well, it looks like understanding the legal and regulatory framework. You, as a director or an officer, should be fully aware of the relevant laws and regulations that govern the organization. So if we say that understanding the legal and regulatory framework is a way to practice diligence, well, how do you demonstrate that diligence? Well, by creating, maintaining, and updating a compliance checklist quarterly. A compliance checklist in which would be listed all of the laws and regulations that you're obligated to follow as a nonprofit, and whoever is responsible for making sure that we are in compliance, initials, and dates said compliance chart. So just that can bring your organization from are we compliant to yes, we're compliant, and here's our compliance chart. Another way to practice due diligence is by establishing a systematic and recurring processes in your board. This can be as simple as adopting a balanced agenda, perpetual agenda, and ensuring that your meetings, and therefore your agendas, allow time for committee reports, management reports, presentations, and full board discussions. So it's by our perpetual agenda or our recurring agenda to make sure that we're tackling all of the board's major files. So, for example, executive director gets, of course, its spot to report, and then all of the committees in the recurring agenda have a spot where they are in the agenda and they are reporting to the board. So practicing due diligence is by establishing systematic recurring processes. And how do you demonstrate that? Well, for example, adopting a perpetual agenda. And this is just one example among many others that you probably already have in your board in regards to establishing, systematic and recurring processes. A third way to practice diligence is to set operational and strategic objectives. So how do you demonstrate this? Well, by annually reviewing with the ED Oversight Evaluation and Compensation Committee the expected results, so the operational standards, and by establishing a strategic vision and imperatives for implementation. So setting operational and strategic objectives, making sure that we have an eye on them and that it's in our processes and that we're doing this annually, reviewing expected operational results and establishing or reviewing maybe the strategic vision and imperatives. The fourth way to practice diligence is to evaluate the organization's and therefore the executive director's performance annually. How do you demonstrate this? Well, by implementing an annual process, which is usually led by the ED Oversight Evaluation and Compensation Committee. So a process to assess the organization's performance in all its aspects, and by documenting the results. Also, another way to demonstrate is by revising the accountability framework, the ED's accountability framework for the following year, based on the previous year's evaluation, therefore based on the previous year's results. And the fifth one that I want to talk to you about today is ensure that the organization actively listens to those it serves, so clients and beneficiaries, as well as other key stakeholders. How do you members, for example, would be another key stakeholder in your organization. So by establishing permanent consultation structures, you are able to demonstrate your diligence, because these permanent consultation structures should enable the board to make evidence-based decisions. So by consulting our stakeholders regularly, by having a good idea of the levels of satisfactions, of the needs, of the trends in our sector, this informs decision making and it helps the board avoid anecdotal decisions. So I hope with these 5 ways of practicing and demonstrating diligence, you will be well equipped to maybe have a little reflection on your board's processes, or maybe be motivated to bring some of those to your board as a director or an officer.